My name is Frank Ally. I'm a California attorney primarily focusing on family law issues. Now let's get started. This episode is about acquiring a community interest in separate property. In prior videos, we talked about what community property is, what separate property is, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but let's go into a little more detail. Because if you have separate property, which is property you own prior to marriage, or by gift, bequest, devise, or profits that we talked about before, that's your property. You get to keep that property. If you end up divorcing later on, that property goes to you and it's not split equally between you and your spouse, ex-spouse. But the community can, particularly over longer term marriages, develop an interest in your separate property. And it's really kind of simple if you think about it. The community develops an interest in your separate property if community efforts are used to increase the value of that asset. And a community effort is basically the application of your labor to that particular operation. So for example, in a house, you have a house, you own it prior to marriage, but that house has a mortgage on it. The money you earn from your employment used to pay down the mortgage creates a community interest because the community is now basically paying down the mortgage on your separate property, and the courts have ruled that that creates a community interest in that particular property. That's called a Moore's margin interest. It's a little bit complicated and there's some math formulas involved. We're going to do a separate episode on that, so look for that below in the link. Let's talk about pensions. Now, important on the community earning an interest in your pension can happen a couple different ways. So we're going to presume for a second that the pension that you've earned through your work at the state, CalPERS, or through working for a union, or working for a private company. The first thing I want you to understand is there's two kinds of retirement plans. One we're going to refer to as pensions. Those are defined benefit plans. A defined benefit plan defines the benefit that you ultimately receive from your work efforts as a formula, number of years times a percentage of your income earned. Okay? The problem with that separate property defined benefit plan that you own prior to marriage is as you continue to work through the marriage, any time that you contributed to the allocation of those benefits, additional months at work, additional higher salary, those are community efforts. They get applied to your defined benefit plan. There's something called the time rule. The time rule is very interesting. It basically will take the number of years that you were married while you were employed and divide it by the number of years that you accumulated your pension. So let's say you're a police officer and you have a 20-year career, 240 months. During the course of that the growth of your pension plan, you're married for 10 years or 120 months during the time your pension benefits are accumulating under the defined benefit plan. That means the community has earned 120 divided by 240 portion of your final benefit. So when you retire, if you're going to make $5,000 in your retirement benefit, the community will be entitled to 1/2 of that $5,000 or $2,500. So when you ultimately retire, you'll get $2,500 as your separate property. You'll get $1,250, which is your portion of the community property, and your spouse will also get $1,250 because she's earned it by application of your community labor. So you'll still walk away with most of your defined benefit plan, but the community, the longer you stay married, will earn a higher percentage of that. That's called the application of the time rule. It's fairly complicated. You should see an attorney about how that works because there's all sorts of offshoots to it, like buy down or buy up provisions and pensions and how those apply. Defined contribution plans are plans that define your final benefit by the contributions you made during the marriage. That would be like a 401k, it could be an IRA. So you own a 401k, you work for a company for 10 years, you get married, you continue to contribute, your employer continues to contribute. From the day you marry onward, that's community money, whether it's your money or the employer's money that's going into the 401k plan. That becomes community money. If you divorce, the way that gets allocated is the administrator of the pension will go back to the day of your marriage, and they will determine what the value of the money is as of the date of your marriage. They will then divide your pension plan in two, and they will run them forward as two separate plans. The money you own prior to marriage will get applied growth, interest, appreciation, and then the community plan, which will start as of the date of your marriage through the date of your separation, will also accumulate interest, growth, appreciation, depreciation going forward. So that's how you divide a defined contribution plan. That's how, when you get a divorce, you can't say, well, I had a pension before marriage, I had a defined contribution plan. Yes, but the community developed an interest by application of your time and labor during the marriage. Businesses are interesting too, because you can own a business, and the question comes down to is, if your business increased in value during the marriage, to what extent has the community earned or acquired an interest in that community business? There's two older cases. There's been a lot of cases since that help better define it, but the two basic cases are called Pereira and Van Camp. The reference below if you want to actually read the whole cases. Like I said, there's been numerous cases since those two cases were decided in the early 1900s. But they are basically the driving influences in California law. Pereira was a barber. He had a barber shop. He would go to work every day. He would shave people. He would cut people's hair. And during the course of his marriage, he increased the value of his business because he was applying his personal labor and efforts to that business. The court found that the marriage or the community developed a significant interest in Pereira's growth because the community had acquired a higher valued business as a result of Pereira's own individual labor. So if you have a Pereira type business, a business that grows because of somebody's labor, the community will gain a bigger interest in that by virtue of your post-marital efforts in growing your own business. Van Camp was different. Van Camp was the old seafood guy, the seafood company, Van Camp Seafood. You probably see it in the grocery store still today. Van Camp owned this company, he inherited it, it was his separate property, there was no dispute about it, but the value of the Van Camp operations increased during the marriage, and the wife attempted to apply the Pereira formula and saying, I get a certain percentage of the growth of the Van Camp company because of husband's efforts. But the court said, no, there's a difference between Mr. Pereira, the barber, and Mr. Van Camp, who sat on the top floor, I think they used the word counting coupons and doing administrative things. Van Camp didn't grow as a result of his personal efforts. The Van Camp Seafood Company grew because the business itself had significant capital investment, and a high degree of the appreciation was due to the capital investment in the company. So Mrs. Van Camp didn't make out as well as Miss Pereira because at the end of the day, it wasn't a community effort that increased Van Camp, and therefore Mr. Van Camp was able to keep more of his separate property. All these things are fairly complicated, but what's important to know is that you need to seek out legal help if there's a business that grew during the marriage, because if you're the owner of the business, you of course want to advocate that the business is still all yours 100% because you owned it prior to marriage. And if you're the spouse, alleging that there were community efforts in there, it's a mathematical calculation, working with forensic accountants to figure out exactly what value you have. But you do have some value, whether it's a Van Camp or Pereira, if the business grew during the marriage. A little complicated, but I think you need to know this as you look through your stuff. I'm Frank Ally, I'm your ally in family law. Hope this helped you, and we'll see you at the next episode.